Well, recently I co-taught a graduate seminar in China to students, PhD, MA students from all over the world. And on the basis of some of the conversations that we had there, I decided it would be worthwhile to make a video that outlines the process of publication, basically from start to finish. So from when you've written your article and it's done, and then you submit it, how that whole process works up to finally seeing it in print. Because at least speaking from my own experience, it can be sometimes a bit of a confusing process, at least at first. Now, as a disclaimer, I should say that although I've published in various topics in philosophy, I'm just one person. I might get things wrong and I might leave things out. So if you think I've missed something or made some serious error, please let me know in the comments below and I'll include it in a pinned comment beneath this video. On then to the process. Okay, so you have your article written. First things first, congratulations. This is a big accomplishment. And it may not feel like it, but it is. You've put in that much work and you've produced something. It takes time, it takes thought. Now, if you're a grad student, in all likelihood, this is going to take one of two forms, your output. Either a seminar paper or a dissertation chapter. And in both cases, it's a good idea to shop your article around to get feedback. One way to do this is to ask for feedback from colleagues or from your supervisor or anyone who's willing to look at it. And another way is to take it to conferences. Present your ideas and get some feedback. And often I find the feedback that I get at conferences can anticipate what reviewers are later going to say in the process, or at least, let's say, it's consistent with them. Now, on the question of polishing, I think it's worth noticing something about the two aforementioned types of writing. Both of them exist primarily for evaluation. In a dissertation chapter, granted you want to make a novel contribution to the field, but at the same time, you're also positioning yourself in such a way to show to your committee, to your supervisor, that you have internalized what's going on in the field and that you're able to position what you're doing in response to everything else. And that produces writing of a certain sort. And the kind of writing that I have in mind involves a lot of this positioning. Author A says X, author B says Y. Recently, some new material has promoted the idea that Z and so forth. And a lot of that in dissertation writing and in seminar paper writing as well comes right up front. That's all well and good. But for an article, you want to make what you're contributing, your statement, something that the reader gets right up front. And part of that is because if you're going to publish it, it's already kind of assumed that you are aware of the background literature, so you have less to prove. And it's also because the assumption is that your readers will also be somewhat familiar with the field. So being told a bunch of things up front while they wait to be told what you're going to say can kind of lose their attention. And I'll tell you that as a reviewer myself, I can spot a lightly edited dissertation chapter often a mile away. So my advice to you is to not assume, and this was advice that was given to me, by the way, by Patrick Girard when I was at Auckland, not to assume that you can just peel off a dissertation chapter and then send it in as is. The kind of writing is quite different. And if you want to get a feel for the kind of writing, just look at what's been published in journals that you respect on topics that you're interested in, and you'll see that it's quite different from dissertation writing. So that's the first thing to be aware of. Another piece of advice that's been given to me a few times is one article, one idea. If you find that you're developing two ideas in tandem, it's probably two articles, which is not a bad problem to have. It's also really worthwhile in philosophy to check out what's going on at the SEP, at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'll include a link in the description. According to their own editorial guidelines, the SEP is written to guide you through the secondary literature. And so it's also a great place to check to see if there's some locus classicus that you weren't aware of. And that's especially important because missing out on that sort of thing is precisely what referees are going to complain about if you do. Okay, so now it's time to submit. And there are, broadly speaking, two places that you can send it off to. One is edited books, which are usually invited, and the other is journals, which are typically not. Both types of publications are valuable, of course, in their own right, although journal articles tend to be held in higher esteem, all things being equal. When you go to the journal website, it's a good idea also to check out all the different things they have to say about acceptance rates and that kind of thing. Usually you'll find this in the FAQ or About section. And that'll give you a sense of what your odds are, again, all things being equal, and how long you should expect to wait. And believe me, the waiting game can take a while. Now, another important thing to do is to select which journal looks like a natural venue for it. There are a few reasons for this. One is you don't want to submit it to a journal that doesn't accept that kind of thing, wait to hear back, and then get it rejected simply because you sent to the wrong venue and have wasted all that time. But the other thing is to think about what kind of readership you're going to have. So here are 3 levels that, in my mind, journals come in with regard to generality of readership. There's the most specific journals that are very field oriented towards one field. So suppose I have a paper on Peter Abelard's logic, the medieval logician. If I sent it to one of these specialty journals in medieval philosophy, it would likely appear alongside other articles on, Thomas Aquinas on God, or Scotus on reasoning, you name it, other medieval thinkers. More general than that would be a general history of philosophy journal. In that case, it would be more likely to appear along, for example, an article on Plato or an article on Kant. That's a more general level of readership, and it's going to be read more broadly, or at least it's going to be seen more broadly than just the specific field of people who are interested in medieval philosophy. One level above that is your general journals. Now, these are very often quite difficult to get into, but your article will then appear next to articles on all kinds of subjects from philosophy, whether it's epistemology of crowds or the relationship between maps and language, that kind of thing. So it's important to think about your audience, who's going to be interested in it, and also who at the journal is going to say, this is right for the audience that we publish for. To take examples from my work, I wrote one on multiple generality in Buridan's logic and a couple of really big and complicated logic diagrams that appear in a manuscript of his Summae. That article appeared in the Oxford Studies in Medieval Philosophy. And that's the perfect place for it because it deals specifically with a medieval topic that is interesting on its own right, at least I think it's interesting, but mainly interesting to an audience that's already fairly steeped in medieval philosophy. A second article that I published deals with humor and the way that humor has been thought about throughout history, now and in the past. And that one I published in History of Philosophy Quarterly, which is more general than the first. My thinking was that, well, apart from the general appeal of humor over logic, that the fact that I was drawing on a variety of historical sources through a broader historical period meant that it would have more interest to a more general history of philosophy audience. And then finally, I have a paper that was just published now, actually, in Dialectica, which is a general readership journal, on Buridan and David Lewis, so on a medieval thinker and a modern thinker. And my hope was that that would be more interesting to just a general audience. And, well, whether or not it is, that's one question, but it seems that the editors at least agreed. So what I'm saying here is specific to what I've done, but I think it generalizes. You can take what you've written, ask yourself, what kind of audience is this for, and what kind of papers would it make most sense to appear next to? Who's going to be interested in this kind of thing? And send it off to a journal that's at that level. Oh yeah, one practical thing is that journals expect you to blind your document, right? So you have to remove acknowledgements, anything that says if you've published elsewhere, I have argued this in X, Y, Z, because then it's obviously you, and the metadata. So even if there's nothing in the document that identifies you, it will still say, if it's, for example, a Microsoft Word document, who it was written by in the metadata. So that's something to scrub. And you can either do it with your own Word or Adobe Acrobat or whatever you're using, or you can use these online platforms that remove the metadata. Now, finally, there are a few technical formalities with the submission process. You're usually expected to confirm that it is not written by AI nowadays, the world being as it is, and also that it's not under review anywhere else. And this is really important. Submitting the same article simultaneously for review to multiple journals is a major no-no, very much frowned upon. I don't know what the penalties are for doing it. I've never tried, and I've never heard of anyone trying, but just don't do it. The journals themselves are, of course, relying on editors, editorial assistants, reviewers, and that kind of thing. And it's really bad for the field if a bunch of people are reviewing the same article for different journals at the same time. So then once it's submitted, you'll get a confirmation email and you wait. And the waiting can take a little while, sometimes quite a while. But in the meantime, you can work on something else. And I will say that it's also because of how drawn out the process can be, that it's a good idea to try to have more than one article out under review at a time. Different articles, again, different journals, but a good idea to try to have more than one thing being considered for more than one venue at any given time. Now at this stage, the most common outcome is what's called desk rejection. The editor or an editorial assistant has a look at it, decides it's not a good fit or it's not interesting to them or whatever, and sends it back typically with no comment. When that happens, I pretty much send the paper back out for review straight away, and hopefully it makes it past that stage eventually, sooner or later, and then it's out for peer review. Now there's a lot said by a lot of people about peer review, but let's start with the basics. Most peer review is what's called double-blinded. They don't know who you are, and you don't know who they are, although the editor knows both parties. Sometimes journals are what's called triple-blinded, where the editor also doesn't know who you are, but knows who the reviewers are. And I want to stress that even getting to this point where your article is out for review is, again, an accomplishment in itself. And I think it's really important to take these accomplishments where you can. Now, there's a wide variety in how much feedback you get from the reviewers and what the feedback is like. Sometimes you get a lot, sometimes not as much, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile. There is a phenomenon that's sometimes referred to as reviewer two, which is not always the second reviewer, but one reviewer will like it and the second reviewer will absolutely dislike it and trash it and say, oh, this shouldn't be published. But one thing that I've found actually is that a friendly reviewer that gives a high volume of comments can be a lot more difficult to accommodate than a hostile reviewer that gives very limited. So there are different things to balance. For example, I wrote a piece some years back and one of the reviewers said, I found a flaw in one section of the paper, in the first section of the paper, and probably the flaw is in the other parts of the paper, but I didn't have the patience to read the rest of it. Well, that's fairly easy to address. In contrast, I had a paper more recently that one of the reviewers gave tons and tons of feedback. Oh, you should connect this, and you could say something about this, and maybe you could draw on this debate and contribute to this thing. And, by the time, if I were to accommodate every single thing that reviewer wanted, it would have been a short book. And this brings me to the point of pushing back against reviewers. It's a delicate business. So usually, if your paper gets sent back to you, and it's not a rejection, you'll get an invitation to what's called revise and resubmit, an R&R. And this is also a really good sign. In fact, a better sign even than just getting it out for review, because it means that the journal is seriously considering publication. Now, in terms of accommodating what the reviewers suggest, when I first started, I would just basically do everything that the reviewers said, thinking if I, accommodate everything, then they can't say no. That's one approach, but as time goes on, you'll develop a feel for what conditions you can push back under. To take the example that I just gave, where I got so much feedback I couldn't accommodate it all, at some point you have to say, this is nice, but I can't do it all. And the important thing to bear in mind in that context is that you don't have to convince the reviewers, you have to convince the editor. At least the final decision rests with the editor. The reviewers will still see your response to their comments and how you revise the paper accordingly, but the ultimate decision to publish is the editor's. Put it this way, even if both reviewers love your paper, give it 100%, publish this now, publish this as is, no revisions required, it's still completely within the rights of the editor to reject your paper. Probably not going to happen, but theoretically possible. So you're addressing the reviewer's comments and criticisms, but you also have to have in mind that it's ultimately the editor that makes the final decision on whether anything gets published. This can lead to what I've also had, the dreaded R&R. You get a revise and resubmit. You resubmit thinking that you've addressed the comments, and then it ultimately gets rejected. But that's relatively rare, at least in my experience. Usually an R&R is a sign that they are very much considering publication if you can convince the editor that you've done a good enough job of accommodating the reviewer's comments and criticisms. Now, sometimes you'll see or even hear people complaining a lot about the review process, and I can understand why people find it sometimes disheartening. First of all, sometimes the rejections feel unfair. Sometimes you feel as though the reviewers are not directly addressing what you're really trying to do with the paper or haven't read it carefully enough. And I get that. But I want to say that from my perspective at least, every paper that I've sent through the review process has come out better. And so although it can be tough, I think it's really worth, by default, taking reviewers seriously and thanking them in the acknowledgements. Not least because reviewers do their work for free. Generally speaking, it's taken to be a service to the profession, in which case you're more or less doing this to help a journal so that they can decide whether or not to publish, because they have to put it through the review process. My policy is that I review one paper for every paper that I've submitted, whether or not the paper got accepted. So that's the peer review process. You go from the editor, who can reject it or send it out for review, again an accomplishment, rejection, or ideally an R&R, which is an invitation to fix it up and send it in again, and then possibly rejection, but all things considered, more likely acceptance after that, again if you can convince the editor. One final remark about rejection at any step of the process. Dealing with rejection can be kind of difficult, especially because you've poured so much time and effort into this thing, and then to have it written off like that and say, okay, well, we don't want it, it can be difficult. Now, the approach that works for me for dealing with this is that I accept that I will just get rejected quite a bit. Not all the time, but fairly often. And if that's the case, if I'm doing my best and I'm also going to get rejected fairly often, I can treat, and I do treat, rejections as a metric for success. So I have a spreadsheet with all the titles of every paper I've written and tried to publish or published or whatever, and then I number the rejections. And I have it set up so that it calculates the total number of rejections. That's just the name of the document, total rejections. And every 10 rejections, I buy myself something nice. Now, why do this? Well, one, as I've tried to stress, rejection is just an inevitable part of academic publishing, no matter how brilliant you are. So you have to accept that it's going to happen one way or another. Getting rejected, as I say, is a sign that you are doing something, which is good. But also, for me at least, when I get that rejection email, I can go, well, that sucks, but I'm going to go and enter that into my total rejections list, which gives me something to kind of do and take my mind off it. I think I'm at something like 67 rejections, and every 10 rejections I buy myself something nice. So I say, well, it sucks that my paper is not going to get published in this journal that I hoped it would be published in, but at least now I'm like 3 rejections away from buying that sweater that I want. So that's how I deal with rejection, by accepting that it's just kind of an inevitable part of publishing. And, it's not a sign that you're bad at what you do. So I say this before we turn to what happens when you do get accepted, just because I think it's really important to accept that rejection is a part of publishing, no matter how brilliant you are, and to figure out a way, whatever way works for you, of dealing with that and not letting it get you down too much. And with that, if everything goes right, your article will be accepted. You'll get a letter of acceptance by email from the journal's editor, and now you can list it on your CV officially as an accepted publication. It's worth noticing, though, that there are a couple of points that are left to be done in this. First, it's still not published yet. In order to get published, it'll have to be put into the formatting of the journal itself. So your document, your Word document or PDF or whatever it is you submitted, will be sent to the copy editing office that will reach out to you and say, please look this over if there are any errors and that kind of thing. At this stage, the time for making significant changes is over. You're checking mostly for typos, getting pagination correct, like did so-and-so actually say this on page 91, that kind of thing. And sometimes you'll get little author queries. Is this the same work that you included in the bibliography? You listed it as 1991, but it says 1992 in one of the footnotes, that kind of finicky stuff. The main issue at this stage is because they've set the pagination, right? Your article begins on, page 210. Changes that result in a change in the overall pagination are generally, if not discouraged strongly, then just not allowed. Because if you do something that changes the publication page numbering, that's going to have a cascading effect throughout every single remaining volume of that journal for that year. Now, that isn't to say that if you spot some outrageous error that you don't want to publish because you realize that it's false, that at this point it's all over but the crying. You can, and in this case, should revise the paper before publishing it. The issue is that at this point in the process, if you choose to do that, you will probably have to have it sent out for review a second time. It's not exactly starting at square one because the editor knows you and it looks principled, which is always good, although of course it's always even better to be principled. But yeah, so it's not like you're locked in at this point. Once you've passed the copy editing stage and submitted your final version, it'll be put online, usually quite quickly, and then appear in print if the journal is a print journal sometime after that. Now here's an important thing, and it's a big difference between North America and, if not Europe, then let's say some European funding agencies. In Canada and the United States, an accepted publication in philosophy is as good as published. There's no formal difference really recognized. In Europe, you can list it on your CV, but at least some funding agencies want to see it in print before you can officially register it in their systems for your application or your reporting or what have you. So that's an important difference and something to keep in mind, especially when you look at the journal metrics and see how long it takes from acceptance to publication, if you're in Europe. Now, one critical thing to be aware of is that if you have a research grant, or if you're working on a research grant, say one that a principal investigator has gotten and then hired you into that position as a PhD or a postdoc, then you have to be very careful in checking how you're supposed to report the funding in the published article itself. So somewhere in the acknowledgements or the final footnote or somewhere, you will have to include a line that says, this was supported or partially supported by the insert agency name here under project blah blah blah, reference number such and such. And you can find the guidelines in the agency website, but this is absolutely crucial because if they paid for it, they want their name on it, fair enough. And also, if you don't put their name on it, sometimes it won't be allowed to count for further applications, which is to say, this publication that you got, great, but you can't apply to that agency and list it among the things that you published on your last project because you didn't credit them. So that's a very important thing to be aware of, is how this reporting works. And on that note, I'd like to thank the FWO for making this video possible. This is not a research publication, of course, but I like to acknowledge them anyway. If you want to know more about the FWO, either their funding schemes or the project that I'm doing here, you can find links in the description. As always, thank you for watching, and let me know what you think in the comments. All right.